When you were in school, you may have learned about a couple American poets, probably Robert Frost and Edgar Allan Poe in the context of The Road Not Traveled and The Raven, respectively. Although if you went to school in the United States, unless you took an advanced English class, you may not have had any more exposure to poetry than that. However, America has a rich and influential history of poetry, and that is what we are going to talk about today. Poetry is a form of literature that uses aesthetic and rhythmic qualities of language to evoke meaning or emotional response. Let's start with the history of poetry. Ancient works may be composed in poetic form to aid memorization and oral transmission. In other words, rhythm and refrains are devices that enable a person to recite a poem from memory. Poetry appears among the earliest records of most literate cultures. Ancient attempts to define poetry focused on the uses of speech in rhetoric, drama, song, and comedy. Later attempts concentrated on features such as repetition, verse form, and rhyme, and emphasized the aesthetics which distinguish poetry from prose. Early poems most likely evolved from folk songs, such as Native American songs, which used poetic devices to make them easier to pass to future generations. The first written poem we know of is the Epic of Gilgamesh from ancient Mesopotamia. The earliest collection of poetry, the Shijing, or Classics of Poetry, is from China. Much modern poetry reflects a critique of poetic tradition. The introduction of writing fixed the content of a poem to the version that happened to be written down and survived. Written composition meant the poets began to compose for an absent audience. The invention of printing accelerated these trends. Poetry began to be written for the eye rather than for the ear. American poetry first arose as efforts by colonists to add their voices to English poetry in the 17th century, well before America became its own country. One of the first recorded poets of the British colonies was Anne Bradstreet, who remains one of the earliest known female poets writing in English. Also important to the narrative of American poetry was Phyllis Wheatley, a slave whose book, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, was published in 1773. She was one of the best-known poets of her day. In the post-colonial America, the Fireside Poets were a group whose name was derived from their general adherence to poetic convention, standard forms, regular meter, and rhymed stanzas, which was felt to make their body of work suitable for memorization and recitation in school and also at home, where it was a source of entertainment for families gathered around the fire. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was one of the most prominent poets of this group. In the 19th century, a distinctly American voice began to emerge. A few notable poets from the early and mid-19th century include Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Edgar Allan Poe, Louisa May Alcott, Walt Whitman, and Emily Dickinson. Emerson and Thoreau are considered the fathers of Transcendentalism, which was the American version of English Romanticism. It arose as a reaction or protest against the general state of intellectualism and spirituality at the time. Transcendentalists believe in the inherent goodness of people and nature. They believe that society and its institutions have corrupted the purity of the individual, and they have faith that people are best when truly independent. Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson represent the birth of two major American poetic schools of thought, the free verse and emotional expression of Whitman, and the structured lyric coupled with irony which Dickinson is best known for, both of which would profoundly shape American poetry in the 20th century. The development of modern poetry is generally seen as having begun in the 20th century and extending into the 21st century. However, much of the American poetry published between 1910 and 1945, which was thought to be too liberal, especially poetry written by women or African American poets, was destroyed during the McCarthy era. Many poets who were popular at that time have gone unknown in recent years. The rejection of traditional forms and structures for poetry that began in the first half of the 20th century coincided with a questioning of the traditional definition of poetry and of distinctions between poetry and prose. Modernist poets wrote in non-traditional forms or in what traditionally would have been considered prose, though their writing generally used poetic diction, rhythm, or tone. Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot were leading figures at the time with their rejection of traditional poetic form and meter. Both leaned towards density and difficulty with an emphasis on techniques such as fragmentation, ellipses, illusion, and juxtaposition. They are cited as having opened up American poetic taste to outside cultural influences, especially from countries like China and Japan. Numerous other poets were equally influential, including Gertrude Stein, Wallace Stevens, William Carlos Williams, Marianne Moore, E.E. Cummings, Amy Lowell, as well as Langston Hughes and Claude McKay, notable poets of the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance included the new African-American cultural expressions across the urban areas of America and introduced a dramatically political dimension to the themes of African cultural inheritance and modern urban experience. It was considered to be a rebirth of African-American arts. After World War II, other prominent schools of poetry began to crop up in America. This brings us to the Beat generation and the Confessionalists. The Beat generation is a literary movement started by the core group of Herbert Huncke, Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, Lucien Carr, and Jack Kerouac, whose works explored and influenced American culture and politics in post-World War II era. Central elements of Beat culture are rejection of standard narrative values, spiritual quest, exploration of American and Eastern religions, rejection of materialism, explicit portrayals of the human condition, experimentation with psychedelic drugs, sexual liberation, and exploration. The female contemporaries of the Beat generation were intimately involved in the creation of Beat philosophy and literature, and yet are almost never included as prominent figures of the movement. In fact, Kerouac, Ginsberg, and Burroughs often portrayed female characters as two-dimensional ideals of the 1950s American housewife. Beat generation women include Eddie Parker, Joyce Johnson, Caroline Cassidy, Hetty Jones, and Ruth Weiss. Although Jack Kerouac introduced the phrase Beat generation in 1948, the term beatnik was coined by the San Francisco Chronicle in reference to the name of the recent Russian satellite Sputnik, the implication being that those of the Beat generation were pro-communism. Confessionalism is another style of poetry that emerged in the U.S. during the 1950s. It focuses on extreme moments of individual and often biographical experiences. Works of confessionalists deal with the psyche and personal trauma, including mental illness, sexuality, and suicide, often set in relation to broader social themes and exploring societal taboos. Confessionalists tended to write in free verse and are sometimes considered postmodernists. The most prominent confessional poets are, of course, Sylvia Plath, John Berryman, and Anne Sexton, as well as Marie Howe, Sharon Olds, Audre Lorde, and Adrienne Rich, though Lorde and Rich are part of a specifically feminist movement in poetry where sexuality, gender politics, and what it means to be a woman are the foremost focus. Another notable poet, Elizabeth Bishop's style of writing was known for its highly detailed, objective, and distant point of view, and for its reticence on the kind of personal subject matter that the work of her contemporaries involved. Where Beat and Confessionalism each described a school of poetry, Bishop, along with other poets such as Theodore Rothke, describe another style of the generation of poets coming out of World War II. Post-Modernism is a movement that developed in the later 20th century and marked a departure from modernism. Typically, it is defined by an attitude of skepticism, irony, or rejection toward grand narratives, ideologies, and various tenets of universalism, including objective notions of reason, human nature, social progress, and objective reality. Postmodernists believe that knowledge and truth are products of social, historical, or political interpretations and are therefore constructs. Robert Creeley and Denise Levertov from the Black Mountain School were among those who brought voice to postmodernism. The Black Mountain School movement based their approach to poetry on Charles Olson's 1950 essay Projective Verse, in which he called for a form based on human breath and a mode of writing based on perceptions juxtaposed so that one perception leads directly to another. Recently, postmodernism has come to convey prose and poetry as distinct entities, and also genres of poetry having meaning only as cultural artifacts. Postmodernism goes beyond modernism's emphasis on the creative role of the poet to emphasize the role of the reader of the text and to highlight the complex cultural web within which a poem is read. We start to see more and more fractures of poetic schools and styles emerging in the late 20th century. In modern day, and especially with the widespread use of internet and thus information sharing, poetry often incorporates forms and language from other cultures and from the past, further removing contemporary poetry from classifications that were once more strict within the Western poetic canon. Today, there is a prominent style of poetry gaining traction online which stems from the traditions of confessionalists and also minimalism, short lines with an emotional punch and often a visual aspect to the poem. These are notably young female poets such as Ruby Carr, Lang Leave, and Amanda Lovelace. There is also spoken word and slam poetry whose roots come from the origins of poetry and show an emphasis on memorable lyrical lines. Poets known for their spoken word performances include Sarah Kaye, Nikki Giovanni, Andrea Gibson, Neil Hilborn, and Saul Williams. And there are many more styles and forms of poetry, and many cropping up every day. The American tradition of poetry has continued to further itself from its European roots and explore style and culture from around the world, like the Japanese haiku and Middle Eastern ghazal. More often, poets are writing about their own cultures and in forms that mimic those of their ancestral cultures. These are poets like Sherman Alexie, Louisa Erdrich, Lee Young Lee, and Juan Felipe Herrera, bringing out the richness of the American voice by including their cultural heritage in their poetry. The lessons we can learn from this are in two parts. First, everything is a product of its history, whether you understand the traditions that led you to where you are or not. And second, if you haven't read a poem you like, stop by your local library and try another one. I hope you learned something today. Please leave a comment down below and fill in whatever gaps I may have missed or whatever notable poets I may have regrettably had to leave out of this particular video. And thank you so much for watching.